For the past 11 years, I've been walking. I started in Africa, walked through the waterless deserts of the Middle East, the lush river plains of India, and across the towering snow mountains of China. My name is Poul Salopek, and I'm a National Geographic writer and explorer. I've now reached Japan. Walking for me is about finding something deeper, recording stories shared across borders and languages that hold meaning, connection, and the answers we often overlook. That's what being a National Geographic explorer is all about. National Geographic leverages the power of science, exploration, education, and storytelling to uncover and protect some of the world's greatest wonders. The lost city of Machu Picchu, the Titanic.
Sucker exists!
Unraveling the origins of mankind. Spearheading research on chimpanzees.
The fascinating thing is that so many of the gestures used by the chimps are the same as ours.
Since its founding in 1888, National Geographic has provided more than 15,000 research grants, supporting adventurers, scientists, educators, conservationists, and other changemakers around the world. Nat Geo explorers go further, dig deeper, and push harder to change something much bigger than themselves. There's a place for them to share their adventures and dreams. It's called the Spark. It's a forum, and also an opportunity to inspire a new generation. Since 2013, I've been retracing continuously, on foot, the ancient migration pathways of our human ancestors, one step at a time. Starting from the cradle of humanity in Africa, I plan to trek all the way to where our wandering forebears ran out of horizons, at the tip of South America. In our fast-paced world, my journey is about slowing down and listening to the ordinary people along my path who inhabit the big stories of our day, whether it's climate change, cultural survival, or technological innovation. Join us as we slow down and take the time to look closer and listen. One encounter, one story, one step at a time.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologize that I will not be able to speak much Japanese tonight. But arigatou gozaimasu for coming and joining us. As I watch this programming, I've seen this programming for the first time in a bit. I find it kind of interesting and actually rewarding that they give explorers designations to writers, people who sit in empty rooms and basically are creating stories with their minds and with their reporting in the field. But that's basically what I do. What I do is basically listen to people across the world and record their stories. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first. Let me tell you sort of how I got into the idea of traversing continents on foot. My background is I have about 30 years worth of experience in international reporting. I was a foreign correspondent who worked based in Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, a bit in Latin America as well. Basically, one of these roving correspondents who went where the action was, right? Who followed hotspots. I was often woken up at night. I was based for 9 years in Johannesburg, South Africa. I would be waken up at night by an editor in a distant city saying, hey, Paul, there's a revolution happening in this country. Or, hey, there's been a coup. Or the president was assassinated. We need you to be on the next airplane. And in my closet, I had what's called a go bag. And in this bag would be ballistic armor, bulletproof vests. It would be a satellite phone. It would be a medical kit. And so essentially, I was kind of a global fireman. That said, over time, over years, I was able to craft a specialization in my reporting to dig deep under the headlines and tell kind of the hidden stories behind the immediate headlines that come spilling out of these devices, right? Every single nanosecond that we're awake, information comes pouring out. And I created some of this information. So I started to say, look, I want to take more time for my stories. I want to go dig into immersive stories, investigative stories, even literary stories about issues like human conflict, the origins of human conflict, cultural stories, stories about the climate crisis, stories about environmental change, stories about human rights. Now, throughout this career, I hesitate to call it a career because it's been so stop and start. I don't really have a conventional career in journalism. I've never taken a single course in journalism in my life. It's all been on the job learning, hands-on. During the course of these years, when I thought I needed a mental break from the stresses of international reporting, of the media world, I would quit and I would go do manual labor jobs, right? I would go work on sometimes in factories, sometimes on cattle ranches, sometimes on deep sea fishing boats. And these were for extended periods of time. So my resume is quite checkered. I'm not sure I'd be hired by anybody these days. But I basically learned also by accident that work, good, penetrating way to get into people's hearts, because we all usually identify ourselves by what we do, right? It's a part of our identity. So think about this, the difference between hiring a car from a big city and going to a rice farmer outside of Kyoto and stopping beside her farm and getting out as a reporter taking notes about how her farm is doing with the climate crisis. Compare that to walking to her farm where she sees you from a distance and you're slowly approaching and she has time to adapt to your arrival. And not only do you begin to say, hi, my name is Paul, what are you doing? How is the climate affecting your rice crop? You actually pitch in. You help her harvest or you help her plant. Think about the kinds of information, the kind of connection that you make with these two methods. So that's what I intended to do with this project that I'll be describing in a minute. This talk is about the spark of exploration, the spark of discovery. I would argue that every single one of you sitting here tonight is an explorer. You don't need a designation from anybody to say that you're an explorer. You are born explorers. Part of being human is exploring. Part of being human is discovering, whether they're internal discoveries or external ones. We're born explorers. I'll share two sparks about my first fires of curiosity that got me launched on this pathway of being a walking storyteller. One is from childhood, a childhood spark of growing up in Mexico. I was born in the United States, but when I was 5 years old, my family moved to the highlands of central Mexico, and I grew up in a rural community outside of a large city where I learned the first things that would help me for the rest of my life, not just in my career, but in my personal life as well. The things you kind of learn in a village, in a small community. And that is the power of connection, right? My neighbors were ranchers. My neighbors were farmers. We depended on each other. There was a communal sense of childcare where everybody looked out for everybody else's kids. If I was having trouble at home, I would go to my playmate's house where my parents would console me, right? I had 100 uncles and aunts who were not related to me. And so as a very, very young person, I began to discover spark number one, for storytelling. And that is the power of empathy, the power of community, the power of human connection. That's spark number one. Spark number two happened decades later when I was already a veteran foreign correspondent. I'd been writing in Africa for years. I'd covered many wars. And I got a fantastic assignment from National Geographic magazine to go spend 6 weeks with the Mbuti hunters in the Ituri rainforest of Congo, a big country in Central Africa with a vast untouched rainforest that is second only to the Amazon in biodiversity and size and cultural diversity. The Mbuti are among the last remnant of hunter-gatherers left on the planet. What I need to remind my readers when I tell them about my walking project, and I'm talking about following ancient people from the Stone Age, is that at some point in all of your family trees, and geologically speaking, not so long ago, all of you were hunter-gatherers as well. 99.9% of the human history, scientists say Homo sapiens, the earliest fossils are 300,000 years old. 99.9% of our time on this planet has been as nomads, hunter-gatherers. And the Mbuti continue to practice this hunting-gathering economy where they move every night from place to place through the rainforest, living off antelope, living off fish, living off wild berries, living off whatever roots they can find. I traveled with them on foot, watching them build their huts each night out of magongo leaves. It took them about 10 minutes to build a house. They would walk away from it in the morning. The house would be gone within a month. It would be eroded back into the soil. It didn't matter to them. They taught me spark number two, to be alert like a hunter. A hunter, man, woman, old person, child, is aware that the solution to the problem can come from any point on the horizon, in front of you, behind you, to the sides. So you had better be awake all the time in order to detect opportunity or danger. It's no surprise to me that the Mbuti are a squatting society. They do this, right? When they stop in the forest to talk, when they cook food, as they're talking around a fire at night, they do this. Why? Because at a moment's notice, they need to do this. Something that we can't do if we're sitting down on our behinds, right? The metaphor here is do not sleepwalk through your days the way a hunter never does. If a hunter is not turned on all the time, if her body is not switched on, she not only misses opportunity, she may step into a problem. So childhood community, be alert like a hunter. Those are my two sparks. Let's talk for a moment then about my project, the Out of Eden blog. Take a look at this. That took less than 10 seconds. It's going to take me 15 years. And I'm about 2/3 the way through time-wise, but only about a little over half geography-wise. I set out from Africa, as the video mentioned, back in 2013. And the idea behind the walk was we are inhabiting a world that is spinning faster and faster in terms of the pace of our ordinary daily lives. I'm in the information business. Information is being created, it's being generated and shared faster and faster. It never stops. It's 24/7. It's in every time zone. It never switches off. We are immersed in a tsunami of information. So as I was flying from story A to breaking story B, from important political story A to important environmental story B to conflict story C, I began to wonder, leaning against the window of all these flights, looking down at darkness, of how many millions of untold stories there were between global story A and global story B. And I began to become aware that every one of them had the potential to be as important, or maybe even more important, than the story that I was flying to for tomorrow's headline. So I decided at some point to get out of the airplane, off the bullet train, out of the taxi, the rent-a-car that I would pick up at the airport, the helicopter, and walk through the stories of our day. Why walk? Because I had the suspicion that the initial people, the first people who spread out of Africa and discovered the world, carried a certain wisdom with them about how to process information at 5 kilometers an hour at this pace, right? The pace of a human walk. Our brains, our bodies, our spirits are designed to absorb the world at this pace. So I said, let me tie together all the incredible stories that I've had the enormous privilege to witness during my career as a journalist. Countries that are falling apart in front of my eyes, countries that are pulling themselves together in front of my eyes, huge global environmental stories, huge wars, stories about economic booms and busts. How about weaving all of these different colored threads together in one continuous story called a journey? The oldest kind of story that we've been telling to each other from the beginning of our species. What did you see today as we gathered around the campfire? What did you see when you went out after the wounded giraffe? What did you see when you went down to the river to collect shells? It's a journey story. We're united by a journey story. And what journey story could be greater than the story that we all took, the journey that we all took out of Africa, if you go far back enough in your family tree, to the uttermost end of the world, the edges of the world, to recreate the first exploration of the world at the original pace that our bodies were designed to absorb information in order to make this old world new again, right? Through the eyes of the original discoverers. So that's basically the first inkling of this project. It was about December of 2012. And the project, as mentioned earlier, will span somewhere between 35 and 38,000 kilometers. One of the main products, of course, is journalism, right? I've written a lot. I've written about 700,000 words. That's equivalent to 7 books of writing. It appears on National Geographic, but it also appears in different kinds of publications. There have been also TV documentaries. There have been radio programming, you name it. There's also a growing education program where we share the walk with thousands of students across the world. So I've walked to you here in Kyoto tonight from Totori. And from before that, a couple months ago, it was Fukuoka. And before that, it was getting on a ship in Busan to come to Japan. And before that, it was walking from Seoul to Busan. Before that, it was 2.5 years of walking across China. Back. What are the lessons of the walk? Let's boil them down to 5. Lesson number 1. Look for rain like the nomads of the Horn of Africa. So what you're hearing here are camel nomads. These people are ethnic Afar. They walk across one of the hottest deserts in the world where daytime temperatures get up to 50 degrees centigrade. They move camels around. They carry their belongings on the backs of camels. And if you watch them closely, if you join them on their journeys across the desert, they are nomads. They do move like our ancestors all the time. One lesson I took away is their resilience at extracting a life out of a very harsh landscape, walking to clouds. Imagine this. Imagine if we were together walking with these gentlemen across an empty desert. You have 2 colors. You have tan and you have blue. And it's almost featureless. There might be a few mountains kind of reddish on the horizons. And suddenly, these gentlemen who are walking like this, their head is always swiveling, looking, right? And their feet are lifting very little off the ground, just a tiny little bit off the ground. They're almost shuffling. They're in this eternal walk of a nomad that's very energy efficient, that allows them to walk 40 or 50 kilometers a day. What are they looking for? They're looking for any tiny wisp of a cloud, any tiny hint of moisture. they will suddenly pivot. If you're not paying attention, you're wondering what's going on. We're going off some vector to some point on the horizon. We're moving here. But if you squint, you'll see a distant cloud. They walk to the clouds in the hope that there's kind of a whisper of moisture that might fall and create a little bit of green pasture. So that's lesson number 1 from the walk with nomads in the Horn of Africa, the Rift Valley, where our ancestors, some scientists say, originated, right? We're going to see, I spent time with anthropologists who were digging up stone tools. Some of these stone tools go way back to the beginning. They're more than 2 million years old. The lesson of these early origins of people, we think that stone tools are primitive. We think they're kind of a sign of kind of being somehow brainless. On the contrary, these tools were like space-age technology compared to the pre-humans that came before. The edges on some of these blades are 1 molecule thick. They are sharper than titanium blades used for modern surgery. So these people were masters of their environment. They were masters of technology. Next lesson. Share what you have, like the refugees of Syria. What we're seeing here are people who have been displaced from what at the time was the biggest war in the world, the civil war in Syria. These families have fled with the belongings on their back across snow mountains in the Middle East to find shelter in the country of Jordan. And I was walking along a road when we came on these tents, and what happened is a testament to human goodness. I often talk to students, and one of the top 3 questions that I get from students around the world about my walk around the world is, isn't it dangerous? Aren't you afraid? And I'm here to tell you that if it were really very dangerous, and if I were paralyzed by my fear, I wouldn't be here talking to you tonight in Kyoto. Being aware of all of my privilege, that I'm a man, that I'm a certain ethnic group, that I carry a passport that has some heft, that I'm backed by powerful institutions, I'm aware of that every step of the way. But if I even set that aside for a moment or use that as a filter, the vast majority of people who greeted me and my walking partners and had no reason, none, to help us. In fact, it would hurt them to help us. 8 to 9 times out of 10 helped us. Complete strangers. The lesson of the refugees of Syria was among the poorest people on earth, their possessions lost, bombed, their houses destroyed, their belongings only that what they could wear on their backs, shared whatever they had with us, their stories, their well water, whatever food they had. In this case, these people were harvesting tomatoes. They were renting out their mussels to Jordanian farmers for just a few dollars a day. They were eating tomatoes morning, noon, and night. Fried tomatoes, boiled tomatoes, raw tomatoes, pickled tomatoes. And they would offer this to us as we stayed in their tents laughing, saying, we can only dream of chicken. We wish we could offer you some chicken, but that's only for our dreams. So that's lesson number 2, the kindness of human beings. Lesson number 3, tear down the walls of fear around yourself and your community. What we're seeing here are scenes from the Silk Road. These shots were taken next to a railway line built by the Soviet Union through the country of Uzbekistan about 50 years ago. And it follows almost exactly a camel trail that used to go between wells across the great steppes of Central Asia. What many people don't know is that this desolate landscape that we're looking at now was the center of civilization 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, the great cities of Central Asia, this is in Uzbekistan as well, were the golden cities of the world. They took Greek philosophy and spread it east. They took Asian technology like paper like forged steel, like porcelain, and spread it west. They exchanged ideas. They exchanged mathematics. They exchanged music. They exchanged culture. The golden cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, which most of you maybe not have ever heard of, were the capitals of global culture. The Einsteins of that era lived here. People like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni. It was the Islamic golden age that gave rise to the Galileos of European Renaissance 400 years before the European Renaissance. These thinkers, supplied by knowledge from around the world, by conduits that brought them ideas from other civilizations, they invented algebra. You know the word algorithm, the one that governs our lives on this technology? It was invented by a man named Al-Khwarizmi, whose name has been changed to algorithm. He invented the algorithm. He was from these outposts of what is now a desolate part of the world, a part of the world where these golden cities about 900 years ago started to get so wealthy that they became polarized and started fighting among themselves and then began building walls around themselves. They began to suspect outside influences. They began to persecute free thinking. They began to discount the very beginnings of scientific methodology. They fell into a dark age. These cities now are just ruins where the dust blows over them. So walking for 2 years through Central Asia, through what used to be an Islamic golden age, gave me another lesson of the walk, which is if it can be done compassionately, if it can be done in a win-win kind of a solution, openness always wins over closedness, not just in human interpersonal relationships, but also among civilizations. Lesson number 4, mind the wisdom of the ancients like the people of Asia. Let's take a look. This woman is grinding spices in northern India. I walked through northern India for 17 months, 4,000 kilometers, crossing the great rivers, the watersheds of the Indus, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra. And what I found in North India was another of those quiet crises that most of the world does not know about, as if we needed more, right? We're already kind of balancing on a tightrope of so many problems. Northern India is experiencing the greatest water crisis on the planet. Up to 600 million Indians, 600 million, are living with either polluted water or inadequate water supplies. What I found in some communities, some of the visionary local leaders, there was a man named Prem Singh who had devised a village community to help farmers who had gone completely industrial. They had gone completely with the green revolution of genetically modified crops, highly motorized tractors, water well pumps, things that required diesel fuel, tons of fertilizer, tons of chemical herbicides. They were literally going broke because they could not maintain the green dream of producing food abundantly using these artificial means because drought and famine had come to their area. So what Prem Singh did in these communities is he began to talk to the oldest people still alive, 90-year-old people, farmers saying, when you had famines, when you had dry seasons here before, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, what did you do? And he began mining the old wisdom of sustainability, sustainable farming. How, if you're a village and you have collective lands, devote 1/3 of it to growing crops, 1/3 of it to pasturing animals, which produces natural fertilizer to fertilize the crops, and 1/3 to water capture. One village alone in Uttar Pradesh, the local people had organized to dig rain pits. What is a rain pit? It's a small depression carved in the sand that's maybe the size of this lobby that will capture rainwater, even passing clouds that just rain for 5 minutes. It will collect there. They hand dug 8,000 of them. in order to connect them into a water reservoir that would see them through any year's drought. They began going back and replanting legacy crops like barley that do well in dry climates. They began adding value to their crops by creating small artisanal factories in their villages that would create jams from their vegetables, or that would pickle their vegetables, or would somehow add value so that they could get some more capital out of their labor, right? So that farmers weren't always at the bottom of the pyramid when it come to economics. They were at the top. They were creating a farmer-centric society. This was another lesson of the walk. Listen to the land, listen to the ancients as we walk together in what promises, my friends, to be a pretty uncertain century ahead of us, right? The last lesson is the forgotten value of nomadism. This is Chengdu in Sichuan, China. This is one of my walking partners, Li Huipu. She's from Chengdu. She's a city girl. And she was showing me her neighborhood, her towns. Chengdu was one of the great trading centers of China. It was also on the Silk Road, one of the Western distribution centers. But even before the Silk Road, 1,000 years before the Silk Road, there was this amazing, mysterious culture called Saxingdui. And what was Saxingdui? Nobody really knows. Archaeologists are just now bringing out evidence of their art. Their art is magnificent. Their art is mainly bronze. It's mostly gigantic masks. It appears to be largely spiritual in nature, and it's totally enigmatic. It's nobody really knows how to interpret it. I don't know how to make the equivalent comparison here, but imagine a Bronze Age Greek city or a Bronze Age city in Japan or in China, one of the great civilizational hubs that has never been uncovered, and they found it by accidentally digging a well. And they're pulling these amazing pieces of art piled on top of each other, big pits. Why? Why were they buried like this? The only thing the archaeologists know is that they were probably taken out of temples, put into a pit, and burned. This civilization may have fallen in a singular event. That means this civilization, which had the highest art at the time in the world, Bronze Age, may have vanished literally overnight from one day to the next. There are theories. There are flood theories. There's earthquake theories. There are theories that the people who survived this natural disaster somehow took their gods and burned them. But what happens to a civilization like this, an advanced civilization, the most advanced artistically at its time, when everything goes belly up, when things fall apart? That's the question that I'm interested in. Archaeologists say they found these artifacts scattered for hundreds of kilometers around in small quantities and small communities. What appears to be the survivors of a great natural disaster voted with their feet. They pulled on their sandals, grabbed their god, and walked, and basically started new hubs of memory, starting over again. I use the example of this civilization called Saxingdui loosely, not as kind of a doomsaying metaphor for the world today. History does not repeat itself over and over again. But we are facing climate crises, we're facing income inequality, we're facing increasing polarization around the world. In the supposedly global era, we seem to be arguing an awful lot with each other, and the natural ecosystems that we've depended on for our food and for all of this are under enormous stress. The lesson of Saxingdui for me on this walk across the world was, maybe not a bad idea to embrace your inner migrant. Maybe not a bad idea to not look down your nose at people from the outside who come, because one day you may be one of them. One day you may be having to migrate over a border for an opportunity or to escape a bad situation. This is not inherently a bad thing. It starts maybe with a negative experience. It can bring negative experiences to the people who live in that community. If your community is suddenly flooded with migrants, I'm not downplaying how difficult that is. But in a changing world, it helps to tap into our inner nomad, the movement that's humming in our bones, even as we sit here today, that's ancient. That's 99.5% of our history. Keep that in your back pocket. Maybe keep a bag packed, because walking and movement is one of the most ancient human coping mechanisms, adaptations, survival techniques. So those are the main kind of meta lessons of the walk. Let me just say that I get questioned a lot about how did the walk affect me personally? You know, never mind these global issues, these common shared concerns, these common shared dreams. Here I am kicking a soccer ball across the deserts of Saudi Arabia. The walk for me was like a soccer ball, one that I kicked across continents. And that soccer ball is the art of storytelling. What I discovered is that the game that we're playing together, the stories that we're telling each other, are not constrained by a 100-meter long field that's centered out, that's measured out by chalk. It's not a rectangle. It doesn't have edges. This soccer game goes to the horizon and over to the edge of the world where the water falls off. Storytelling, the power of storytelling, is understanding, for me personally, that every story that I encounter and every story that I tell, no matter how seemingly small it is connected to another story, which if you tug on it is connected to another story, which if you pull on it is connected to a fourth story. Every single story in our lives is connected to another story. The artificiality of the media, the illusion that journalists ask all of us to accept, is that stories have tidy boundaries on a website. There's a square around them. That's an environmental story. There's another square with text or a photo or a video. That's a political story. What I'm here to tell you is the greatest reward for me as a storyteller, emotionally and intellectually, is that by walking through the stories of our day, I see how they are absolutely interconnected, and that a war story might be related to an education story, and that a health story might be related to a story about gender rights, right? The walk has allowed me to kind of throw away the old glasses through which I was looking at how the world is organized, and it has unified it into one continuous song, right? The song might have lyrics that change, but it's still the same song. So with that, the next step would be the importance of not walking alone. So people often ask, okay, Paul, you've been walking for 11 years. You've never gone home. I've not got in a plane and gone back to America. I've kept on the trail the whole time. Isn't it lonely? Aren't you sacrificing some interpersonal relationships? And the answer is yes, of course it gets lonely. Of course I've made sacrifices, right? But as this video shows, these are snippets of the people that I've had the honor of walking with. If you choose to walk with somebody and share your journey, it is a completely different, and I would argue bigger journey than if you're walking alone, at least if you're in the storytelling business. Because imagine, put yourself into my walking shoes. If I'm walking across Japan, you're going to hear my droning voice over and over, my inner monologue over and over again, and it gets even boring for me sometimes. But if I'm walking with different people, if I'm walking with a photojournalist, if I'm walking with an astronomer, if I'm walking with a young art student, if I'm walking with a farmer, the story changes, the story grows richer because their voices then become equal to mine. So I try never to walk alone. And there's something about walking. I don't know if any of you have found this on your own journeys. There's something about walking that creates a very quick and deep intimacy. You are walking side by side through a landscape, and you begin to talk about your stories, your biography. You begin to exchange impressions. Walking compresses time when it comes to making deep connections. So I have walked with, I don't know, something like close to 200 people, ranging from those Afar camel nomads to astrophysicists in Kazakhstan, to poets in China, to a photojournalist here in Japan. They become like brothers and sisters to me, and I stay in touch with them. I'm in touch with almost all of them. We stay in touch by social media, and I've got to see their marriages. I've got to see their babies born. And I've got to see them launch their own projects, books, storytelling projects, cultural guides, new businesses. And just a month ago, unfortunately, we got to share our first obituary. One of the first walking partner passed away. So my community is very widespread, but it's very tight. With that, I'd like to extend the invitation to have my Japanese walking partner, if he's around, Soichiro, to come join us up here. Soichi, come on up. Soichi, can you tell a little bit about your background?
僕は29歳までは、いろんな仕事をしてきて、写真を始める前はトラックの運転手をしてました。ちょっとしたことから、カメラを持って、海外を旅するということを始めまして、フリーランスという立場にいます。
Your photo projects are slow journalism, slow storytelling, like my projects. You sometimes spend years on a project. You're telling me by one story that you're working on at Fukushima is 13 years on one story. This is like, even by my standards, that's like I bow down to you. That is a great human endurance for keeping at a story. We covered a couple wars. I mean, we were in Iraq together too, right? So unknowingly, we have a background in that. Soichi, I'd like you to, if you don't mind, kind of just walk us through how the walk has been so far.
博多を出発して、下関の方に来まして、で、本州に渡り、彼がなるべく田舎の方を歩いた方がいいということで、長門の方に上に向かって、で、それからまた下の方に下り、瀬戸内海の方に出て、で、広島からまたそのまま鳥取へ。で、今、鳥取の方を越えて、浜坂という、兵庫県の方。今、GPS を止めて、ここにいるという感じです。
What did you, we both talked a lot about what we've learned walking through the Japanese countryside together.
歩いて旅をするというそのペースというのに最初はすごく戸惑いました。というのは、例えば車で30分ぐらいのところを、歩くと1日かかるわけですよ。だから動いてるっていう感じがしないんですけど、でもそれがだんだん慣れてくると、細かいディティールとかそういうものをよく拾えるようになってくるんです。それがすごくですね、写真を撮るには歩くペースが非常にいい。一緒に彼と歩くことによって、違う目で、そういうところを見るようができて、なんか違う、日本なんですけれども、違うところを歩いてる感覚もあって、すごく面白いです。
Remember the first few weeks of the walk, how hot they were? Do you remember those days?
Yeah.
Remember talking to farmers? Remember what they were saying?
Mm-hmm.
That it was the one of the hottest summers and autumns in their history. They're saying they had never seen anything so hot before.
Yeah.
So, a couple of farmers that we talked to, many of whom were elderly, were quite old, were saying that they were thinking of quitting farming, right? Stopping farming. Yeah. They were also saying maybe they might have to change crops. Had you known about this before you started walking?
そういう話も具体的には知らなかったんですけど、あるいくつかの、農家の人にお話を伺ったんですけど、やっぱ皆さん同じことを言うんですよ。借り入れ時期がずれてくる。取れる量が減っている。
What about your perception of kind of how quiet the rural landscape is?
田舎を歩くと誰とも会わない。あとすごく静か。あれはすごくちょっとショックを軽く受けました。だからそういうことを知るっていうのも今回一緒に歩いたことで実感したことです。ちょっと逆に、ポールに質問なんですけど、日本をこうやって歩いて今2ヶ月半ぐらいですけど、どういうふうなことを感じてますか、日本に対して。
Well, we share a lot of the same impressions from our walk. First of all, the friendliness and the curiosity of the people that we meet along the way has been very refreshing and very welcoming. People have been very open to two strange guys walking with backpacks through these villages that they don't see too many people on foot on ever, maybe for last decades, right? So that's always a delight. About 80% of my walk across the world is in rural areas, simply because that's most of the world, right? Cities are small geographical areas. I have noticed a pattern, Soichi, from rural areas in China to South Korea to Japan. It's part of the same pattern of a depopulated countryside, fewer and fewer people. I saw it in China. South Korea was pretty much the same, and of course here in Japan. But I was struck by how empty the Japanese countryside can seem.
Yeah.
It can be very silent. Southern Honshu, for example, big portions of it, we would not see one person for half a day. What does that mean for issues like food security in Japan, right? What does that mean for the preservation of memory in Japan? So these are questions that you and I have discussed many kilometers walking through villages. I mean, did that strike you as something? Did you realize it was that kind of way? I mean, everybody has read about migration from countryside to cities. I read about it, but did this level of it, was that new to you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. そう、僕も同じように思いますね。あと、家があるんですけど、人の気配がしない。だから、ポールが聞くんですよ、よく。ここは、空き家なのかって。でも多分空き家じゃないと思うんだよね、みたいな、会話をしながら、田舎道を歩くんですけど、僕も日本で生まれて日本で育ってますけど、で、彼はアメリカ人で、メキシコ育ちですけど、同じ印象を持ってるんですよね。同じところを歩いて。
In conclusion, I think one of the amazing things about walking through these quiet landscapes is that when we did meet somebody, it was almost like an occasion of joy, right? Because people were so happy to see somebody who would be willing to stop and talk to them and not just drive by. So we had some great conversations along the trail. And again, we're shown great kindnesses. We often made friends with the people that we stayed with. Yeah. Well, thank you, Soichi, for sharing your foot journey. And again, thank all of you. I would encourage using walking as a tool of discovery. What's amazing about it, you don't have to walk across Honshu, and certainly you don't have to walk across the world, but even as a tool of rediscovering home, is what Soichi is talking about, is often the bigger delight than even what I'm discovering. Because think of it this way, I've never walked through Japan before. This is my first extended time in Japan. Me, everything's going to be new. So I'm ready to be surprised. I'm ready for new things, and I'm used to it. But Soichi is walking through a landscape that he thought he knew. He's walking through a home that he thought he understood. So the surprise for him is even greater than for me. And I've seen this over and over across the world. So I encourage you to undertake your own explorations on foot. Thank you, Soichi, and thank you all.